I don't really lecture well, but I do tell stories a lot. And what you're going to hear tonight are some stories. They're stories about the four horsemen, well, one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, the one that was responsible for more death than war and famine put together. I'm talking about pestilence. You know, from our earliest days when we were a territory and not yet a state, pestilence played a huge part in our history. In the frontier, as I'm always telling people, the first thing you need is a place to bury people, because death was an everyday visitor. So our graveyard, over the one that's supposed to be the oldest over at First Presbyterian Church, went on the maps in 1791. And as I often point out to people on my tours, it couldn't go on the maps if it wasn't already being used, right? So it was already a burial place when it was put on the map in 1791. And this place had had frequent visitors from several different settlements by 1791, but here in East Tennessee, the Cherokee people were the ones who established sort of what we would call the beginning of civilization. They made their capitals here. Both Chota and Tanasi are close to Knoxville. And they came here because it was supposed to be healthy. There was these icy mountain springs and these clear mountain creeks going down into the rivers. They were clean, they were healthy. Until the white settlers got here and the huge amounts of people came in with poor sanitary practices and a whole host of germs that the Native Americans had absolutely no resistance to. Microbes were the weapon that civilization used most effectively against the Cherokee and other native tribes. Whole villages were wiped out by invisible killers. Many historians believe that the epidemics here in Tennessee, particularly in the southeast, were worse than any other place in the New World. That's what they called it, the New World, the Europeans. Smallpox, yellow fever, cholera, influenza all played their part. Before we go on, I'm going to show my health professional education and kind of quibble about terms here. So, an epidemic is defined as a rapidly spreading disease affecting a collective population simultaneously. A pandemic is an epidemic on a larger scale. It may affect a nation, a continent, or even the whole planet. Research indicates that East Tennessee had several epidemics over our 225 years of recorded history, and some were part of a larger pandemic. The early attacks of smallpox here were a part of a larger pandemic that covered the entire Western Hemisphere as Europeans came to what they would call the New World and spread their old world diseases with the unsuspecting native peoples. So, a scourge here in Knoxville in our earliest days was yellow fever. And yellow fever is carried by the Aedes or Haemogagus mosquito. It acquires the virus from infected primates, human or otherwise, and transmits it when they bite. This type of mosquito is no longer common in this part of the world, but it's still endemic to parts of Africa and South America. There's been an effective vaccine for over 80 years, but we should all take a moment to breathe a huge sigh of relief that this mosquito lost out in the habitat competition around here, because yellow fever is a nightmare disease. It's still incurable. Now here's a description from an article in a 19th century medical journal. As the disease progressed, the pain worsened, crippling movement and burning the skin. The fever rose to 104, perhaps 105 degrees, and the bones felt as if they had been cracked. The kidneys stopped functioning, poisoning the body. Abdominal cramp began in the final day of illness as the patient vomited black blood brought on by internal hemorrhaging. The victim became a palette of hideous color. Red blood from the gums, eyes, and nose. The tongue swelled and turned purple, and the skin grew deep gold, the whites of the eyes turning brilliant yellow. Not for the weak of stomach, sorry about that. But this disease was still around when the first Knoxvillians were arriving, including the first owner of the house, William Blount. Now, he suffered on and off from what the doctors called bilious fever in those days. The yellow fever is, as I said, still incurable. Today we know that only 15 to 25% of the cases develop serious symptoms that lead to death. And today, hospitalization can control the fever and pain in those cases and help those patients recover. Governor Blount's fever may have been a milder form of the virus, which goes into remission after 48 hours and from which most people recover. He kind of experienced symptoms periodically throughout his life. Unfortunately, doctors in those days were more likely to be a hindrance to recovery rather than a help. In the late 1700s, the theories of medicine developed in ancient times by Hippocrates were still pretty popular, including the idea that health was dependent on balancing 4 humors of the body: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Thus the practice of bloodletting, in which the physician would open a vein on the patient, usually on the arm, and remove, a pint or so of blood. This was used to treat everything from sore throats to gout to epilepsy. In the 18th century, they had invented spring-loaded lancets and something called the scarificator. The scarificator, people. I mean, it doesn't sound like an instrument I want anything to do with. This is a multi-bladed device that would make parallel cuts. It was supposed to make it less painful, but I don't know about you, but I would run if anybody came at me with this thing. And I don't know if they used it on Governor Blount, but if they did, but no wonder he died. According to his biographer, in the winter of 1799 and 800, there had been a general illness here in the area. In March, Mrs. Blount's mother, Mrs. Granger, caught malarial fever. Now, she was living in the house with the Blounts at the time, and Mrs. Blount and 2 of the children would eventually get this. Mrs. Granger died on March 11th, and the very day of the funeral, the oldest son, Billy, caught the same disease, and he went down with it that night. Governor Blount was helping to nurse him, so he was back and forth walking through this chilly house. It was still early spring, so not warm at night, and he caught a cold. Well, on March 15th, he felt better, so he was well enough to sit out on the porch and read the paper and drink his coffee as usual till after dark. And then, half an hour later, he got a violent chill and became feverish and delirious. After 2 days, however, the fever broke. He was sensible again. He seemed to be better. He said he didn't need anyone to sit up with him that night. He was fine. He kind of dismissed his doctor, Dr. Fournier. And that very night, the cold struck again, and he got worse. Dr. Fournier was called back in and commenced treating him with the recommended treatments for congestion and respiratory distress, blistering and purgatives. Blistering, or vesiculation, was the practice of purposely applying a caustic medication to the patient's skin to raise blisters. This was supposed to drain the fluids, the bad fluids, out of the body and stimulate the affected organ. The usual method was to combine the caustic with a boiling liquid, soak a cloth in it, and apply it to the patient near the affected place, wherever it was. Various powders were compounded and mixed with boiling water or vinegar and applied to the patient's arms, legs, chest, even the top of their head. They would have blisters all over by the time the treatment was done. Mustard, pepper, verdigris were common ingredients, but they also used, they were usually combined with cantharide powder, which is made from ground up blister bugs. Now, if your bug is named a blister bug, you don't want to touch it, right? Seems like common sense to us, right? Don't touch the blister bug, but no. They ground up the powder and put it in the poultice and applied it to their skin to purposely create these blisters. And another one was pounded squill, which is a root that is still common in the Middle East, but squill was also, it was mixed with vinegar normally, and it was also used as a purgative. Now, purging was another method of treatment, that was used to correct the imbalance of the 4 humors, and it was also, it almost sounds a little bit sensible to try to flush the body of the thing that's bothering it. They thought they could get this purgative in there and it would flush out whatever was causing the illness. And sometimes things like lemon juice and aloe of ash are still used today for things like colitis. It does seem to have a helpful effect. But in those days, the doctors preferred stronger, more caustic purgatives that ended up removing much of the needed fluids from the body and did nothing to kill the germs that were actually causing the problem. Governor Blount Poor thing, he only lasted a couple of days after treatment like this. On Friday, March 21st, he had a paroxysm, a seizure of some sort, and lost his ability to speak. Witnesses say that tears came down his face, and he turned his face to the wall and died. Pretty sad. From the description of his last hours, it sounds to me, because of the congestion, that his cold had turned into pneumonia, and probably his immune system, which was weakened by these bouts of yellow fever he'd had over the years, just couldn't fight it. Mrs. Blount was too ill with the malarial fever to go to the funeral, and she would succumb to jaundice 2 years later. Now, as the mosquitoes who carried it began to lose out to the hardier species more suited to the colder climate of the East Tennessee mountains, yellow fever would become rare in Knoxville, though a serious outbreak in Tennessee occurred in the warmer, more humid city of Memphis in 1873. Hundreds fled this horrible infection, and some arrived at the Knoxville train station. A boarding house on Broadway and Depot near the station became a de facto quarantine for arrivals who exhibited symptoms of the fever, so the disease didn't really spread much here. However, the proprietor of the boarding house, a Mr. Bob Brown, was one of the unfortunate few who caught it and died. Only trying to do his job, poor guy. Now, as the Cherokee were moved out and more immigrants arrived, the town experienced different waves of the disease, of different diseases. There are low-lying areas around First Creek and Second Creek were prone to flood. Stagnant pools of water would lay along the street we now call Central. It was originally called Water Street because it was wet. It flooded a lot. Due to its tendency to flood, the land was cheap, and this attracted industrialists who built sawmills and tanneries, washing their wastes in that handy creek and forming ponds of wastewater. The cheap land also attracted poor people, and the neighborhood of Cripple Creek formed on the northeastern side of the valley. As the residents increased, so did the municipal waste flowing into the open sewers to the creek and the river. Cholera is reported to have entered Tennessee in 1832 via the Mississippi River at Memphis, and it spread along the roadways and rivers, major travel routes, as the infected fled. The causative microbe is Vibrio comma and enters the human body through food or water contaminated by other victims or flies that have come into contact with infected bodies or infected waste. The bacteria multiplies rapidly in the human gut. So symptoms could come on with the speed and force of an axe blow to the head. People would actually fall down in the street with cholera, a sudden attack of it. One description of cholera says that it is as if a faucet has been attached to the body and turned on full blast, emptying it of all fluids. Vomiting and diarrhea cause dehydration so extreme that the blood begins to congeal. And death, feet, hands, and skin wrinkle, turn blackish blue, and draw up. In 1832, Knoxville only had light cases, but in 1838, there was a severe epidemic, killed hundreds of people. We really don't know if it was cholera for sure because the initial descriptions are pretty sketchy. In those days, newspapers wouldn't report death tolls because they didn't want to cause a panic. The local physicians called it the fever, or later they would call it the Black Death, which sounds sort of like cholera, but there weren't really very many records kept in those days. However, if you read the newspapers for the summer of 1838, you get a few clues. On October 22nd, the editor of the Knoxville Press, Colonel W.B.A. Ramsey, who was the brother of J.G.M. Ramsey of Ramsey House, states, "The number of obituary notices tell a melancholy tale as to the health of our city. The disease has been confined to the immediate valley of White's Creek, not a case on College Hill. The female academy is also considered outside the infection area." So basically, low-lying areas. White Creek is another name for First Creek, by the way. Editor Ramsey refers to the ongoing sickness as a poisonous malaria or a bilious fever, but he continues to note that the cases are occurring in low-lying areas near the creeks and rivers, where the stagnant mill ponds have been drying up from the previous summer drought. The stinking gases produced from the decaying organic matter in these ponds, they were considered to be the cause of this infection. They were called the miasma. Lovely name. Ramsey is more forthcoming than usual than most editors because not only was his business affected, on several occasions The paper could not be printed or was only printed in a very abbreviated form called a slip because he only had one staff member well enough to report to work. He says so in his comments on the side. The other reason was that his household was affected. His stepson, John James Ramsey White, who was age 12, and then his stepdaughter, Elizabeth Lawson White, who was age 9, both caught the infection and died. Later on, his brother-in-law, Colonel James Scott, would catch it. In October, he wrote, "In the short space of 6 weeks have 2 children and a brother-in-law been snatched from our domestic circle by the ruthless hand of death." The most detailed account of that fearful summer, and my favorite, was provided by John Henry Crozier, who wrote an article published in the winter after the epidemic was over. Crozier said his health was never better that summer, and that he walked about in the town every day. Hundreds had fled to the countryside in terror of the disease, which Crozier describes as a sudden onset of fever, patients appearing well, then suddenly dying. Now, the speed of the attack and the cases occurring in the low-lying areas makes it sound very much like cholera, but he also mentions bleeding from the mouth and nose in a couple of cases, too. The population of Knoxville fell from 2,000 to around 500 by September, as townspeople fled, leaving their homes and businesses. Crozier describes the deserted scene very vividly, how the sound of a wagon could be heard blocks away, and then the hoofbeats would echo for several minutes after they passed by. Travelers didn't linger, he said, riding through the afflicted town with handkerchiefs tied over their faces. And even the remaining citizens were silent, gliding through the streets on their way to it, like a spirit on their way to a sickbed or funeral. Excuse me, just 1 second, I'm gonna get some water. I'm not sick. Don't worry. Just dry. But if I keep coughing, you guys are welcome to run. It's been done before. Okay. Now, people who were left behind, the people who fled left behind personal possessions and animals in their hurry to get away. Crozier tells of a young boy who captured 2 buzzards and brought them home as pets, but they were left behind when his family fled to the country. Here's a quote, "As they flew," but they apparently escaped their pen after the family left. "As they flew and flapped their filthy wings over the town, with none to molest them or make them afraid, a report was circulated that the well citizens of Knoxville were too few to perform the funeral rites that were demanded of them, and that the buzzards were preying on the corpses of the dead." Now, Crozier asserts very firmly that this is not true, but as one of the well citizens and a promoter of the town, wouldn't he say that anyway? Don't you think? If they were doing it, he wasn't going to tell. Now, Knoxville did finally recover from this epidemic, but cholera was not done with us. There would be further epidemics in 1848, 1849, and 1854. In those days, the press was still reluctant to cause a panic by reporting the prevalence of cases. But the terror of the disease was so great that even the rumor of cholera was enough to cause people to flee and, of course, spread the infection wherever they fled. The railroad workers who were working on the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad line were so scared that they actually left their tools lying by the track and ran. This delayed the completion of the railroad track for a whole another year because they wouldn't come back till the disease was over. One citizen who stayed to minister to the dying was William Ganaway Brownlow, better known as the Parson, that vitriolic newspaper editor who was hated and loved by almost everybody in town, depending on who you were talking to. He even buried many of the dead because there's nobody else to do it. And there's not a whole lot of nice things you can say about the Parson, but you can't say he wasn't brave. He did what he had to do. The first to die in 1854 was Colonel John McClellan, who was the brother of George McClellan, who would make his name as a Union general several years later. John McClellan was in charge of river improvements, which I find a very telling thing because areas near the water, he's down there working on the river improvements, and the areas near the water were singled out as the sources of most cases. But they spread lime on the streets all over the city in every direction. They didn't care. They were using lime on the streets to supposedly kill some of the germs. The highest number of deaths in one day was Sunday, September the 2nd, when 13 people died on that day. Samuel Newman, who was an undertaker, recorded filling orders for 72 coffins in 6 weeks. And the death toll is supposed to be estimated about 100 in all. Now, theories of disease transmission were pretty hazy in those days. Microbes were known to exist, but even doctors really didn't know much about their behaviors and their life cycles. Night air and our old enemy miasma were blamed in the 1850s, as well as immorality. According to an account in William Rule's Standard History of Knoxville, the mayor prohibited the sale of melons within the city limits, but several disregarded this and smuggled in contraband watermelons. Did you guys have some watermelon back there? Okay. This was risky behavior, and it was blamed for the subsequent cases. So, in fact, the writer goes on to say that the cause of death had been shown to be the result of imprudence in either eating or drinking, especially in the use of certain vegetables and intoxicating drinks. All right. Now, this attitude was still prevalent in 1873, although the city was beginning to recognize that the runoff of sewage and contaminated water from tanneries and stockyards was a potential source of infection here. Just getting the clue here. A board of health was appointed to be in charge of sanitary matters. This was in 1873. They were given authority to see that their recommendations were carried out. So all the mill ponds and dams were to be kept as full as possible to reduce the runoff. And dry clay, dry coal ash, and chloride of lime were used as disinfectants in the wastewater ponds. Iron sulfate was ordered for every privy where a possible cholera case occurred. And still, the victims were often blamed for their own illness, as the case notes made by Health Officer Dr. F.K. Bailey indicate. He describes both the diet, habits, and circumstances of the patients he treated in great detail. I read the whole report, it's fascinating. Beginning with the first fatality of that deadly summer on June the 24th. He was married and in comfortable circumstances, full sanguine temperament, imprudent in all his habits, a great eater, gross in appearance and weighing 225 pounds, drank daily of whiskey. On the morning of his attack, he remarked he had no fear of cholera, and with an oath stated he could eat vegetables to any amount with impunity. Those who took dinner with him state he ate freely of cucumbers, green beans, and other vegetables, drank a quantity of cold water, and during the afternoon was seen to take whiskey and ice cream. Contraband vegetables, whiskey, and ice cream. This guy had it coming. He was taken ill at 5 o'clock and dead by midnight. Dr. Bailey's notes contain graphic descriptions of every patient's symptoms, but don't worry, I'm not going to repeat any of those this close to mealtime. I don't want to ruin your appetite. He faithfully records the medicines that he administered in each case as well. The standard dose was a mixture of laudanum, which is mostly morphine mixed with alcohol, bismuth, or milk of magnesia, so we would know that, and calomel. Now, calomel, or mercury chloride, was also used to treat syphilis, and it did kill germs. It probably helped as long as the mercury poisoning didn't kill you first. So Dr. Bailey says this mixture of laudanum, bismuth, and calomel would halt the disease if it was administered early enough. The main symptom that brought people to him in time he described as a heaviness in the stomach, as if the person had swallowed a lead ball. Most of the cases that recovered were healthy young people who were treated early, which is not terribly surprising, is it? Their immune system helped them fight off the disease after the mercury killed maybe enough of the bugs to give the organisms to give them a chance. So Dr. Bailey's report ends with some speculations on the causes of the outbreak, and though he feels he can't eliminate the possibility of detrimental behavior playing a role, he does point out the frequency of cases along First and Second Creek, and the possibility that the water might somehow be carrying some germs. It's worth noting that Dr. Bailey himself went down with the fever on August 24th, and he was ill for 2 weeks, but he recovered. Perhaps this gave him the idea that maybe low moral standards weren't always the cause of disease. 10 years after cholera had Knoxville in its dread grip. Another pestilence made a visit, a virus that wiped out entire villages in the first days of settlement and was still a deadly scourge right up to the last half of the 20th century, and I'm talking about smallpox. By the time Tennessee achieved statehood, Dr. Edward Jenner, the country doctor from Gloucester, England, had already discovered he discovered that cowpox made you invulnerable to smallpox, so he had introduced these inoculations from the cowpox virus and began a lifelong work, really, of trying to convince other people this has worked. He did a lot of research and he popularized the vaccinations. The smallpox was called the speckled monster. That was because everybody broke out in spots, and it would be very terrible, disfiguring, much worse than chickenpox, just terrible disfiguring scars if you survived. By 1802, the high rate of infection among the native peoples in the U.S. caused the U.S. War Department to enact measures to curtail the disease for entirely selfish reasons, of course. The soldiers were getting sick because of their contact with the natives, and also the early settlements were in danger of smallpox because the natives were so sick. By 1832, the first large-scale vaccination of Native Americans was authorized by Congress. The disease began to fade somewhat, but it would return to haunt us later. In the later part of the 19th century and the early 20th, smallpox would return to terrorize a new generation. In 1883, formaldehyde and sulfur were agents of choice for disinfection. Now, formaldehyde is a respiratory irritant that causes chest pain, coughing, shortness of breath, and has been linked to cancer. Sulfur, it has a lower toxicity, but it is caustic to skin and eyes and can cause swollen lungs if inhaled. However, the electric streetcars here in town were fumigated with these two toxic chemicals, especially right before they entered the better class of neighborhoods, because these poor people might have left their germs on them. The entire police force was forced to take a formaldehyde shower when a smallpox victim accidentally exposed them in the police station on Market Square. Now, the treatment of those who became infected sounds just horrific to us now, because victims were sometimes put in small boats which were tethered out in the river with a yellow flag on it. A yellow flag meant smallpox, and these were also placed on the houses of the victims. Guards could be posted to prevent people from exiting or entering. The clothes of the survivors were burned, and their household pets were shot. One 5-year-old boy was ordered by a doctor to walk from his home to the quarantine area, preceded by a guard who walked 20 feet in front of him, waving a yellow flag and saying, "Oh, keep away." Now talk about your serious childhood trauma. Do you think that kid was like cursed for the rest of his life? I would be surprised if he wasn't a serial killer. Wealthy folks, of course, could hire guards and just stay in their homes because they could hire people to be the ones keeping people out. But if you couldn't do that, a lot of victims ended up in the pest houses. Pest house was short for pestilence house. And originally, Knoxville's pest house was on what was on the west side of Knoxville at the time, which was the fashionable Fort Sanders area. It's called West End probably in those days, though. But of course, none of those people wanted to be near it. Nobody wanted to be near the pest house. And they convinced the people traveling on the train even said they could smell it as they traveled past it on the train with the windows open. So people who lived nearby convinced the city council to move it in 1903. A site was chosen on the east side of Chilhowie Park, which was fairly rural in those days. It was on top of a hill, away from everybody's houses, kind of lonely. They built 4 buildings, surrounded them with a high fence, and created a smallpox quarantine camp that would be used for about 30 years. 2 bulldogs guarded the fenced area at night to prevent intruders, but also to prevent the patients from escaping. So once you got there, you were there. The 50-plus patients from the previous pest house were moved there by 6 wagons, and they had to make a wide circle to the north so that they didn't want them passing through the populated downtown area, so they made them circle around the town back to the east side location. They disembarked to enter the pest house buildings, and they would stay there till they died or got better. Over the rest of 1903 and 1904, over 1,600 cases of smallpox would be diagnosed. Some would survive with disfiguring scars, but many would die. The ones who died were buried in the cemetery right behind the camp as quickly as possible. often by the doctor on night duty. These late night burials by the frail gleam of a lantern. One doctor described it as scenes to stand your hair on end. The occupants of the pest house here in Knoxville complained it was horrible and unsanitary, and some even sued after their stay there. But not all the reports were bad. One patient interviewed by a Knoxville columnist, Bert Vincent, back in the 50s, he remembered going there as a child with his entire family, and his mother, who had been inoculated and was not sick, went with them to nurse her children and her husband. She even took the family cow so that they would have fresh milk. Now, the food and water provided at the pest house was at least fresh and sanitary, and even if the staff delivered it through narrow slits to avoid contagion, which reminds you of the old joke about pancakes, pizza, and things that will fit under the door, they literally fed them through slits in the door. The medical records indicate a higher cure rate, however, in the pest houses probably because they did get some medical attention there and were fed regularly. They did give them some pain and fever reducing drugs to help alleviate the suffering, and people who stayed home might infect their entire household and not have anybody well enough to nurse them. So it was really, in remote rural areas, a whole family could die before anybody knew they were sick. It remained in use, the pest house, until the 1920s, though fewer and fewer cases occurred as the vaccinations became the norm rather than the exception. Now, I was going to say that smallpox vaccination was painful. That's one of the reasons people didn't get it in the beginning, because they would make crosshatch cuts in your skin and then apply the vaccine to the wound. So it would hurt, and people didn't want it. The city council tried to fine people who refused it, but since many of the people who were refusing it were too poor for a fine to really be possible to collect, they eventually just had to assign a doctor the job of inoculating people, and he could force people to take the inoculation. I think this was after the epidemic in the early epidemic in 1903. So now, the old pest house building stood empty, was finally torn down, but in the 1980s there was a controversy. I found articles about this in the paper, when a developer wanted to rezone that property for commercial use, and the old cemetery was still there. So the residents of Plantation Hills, which is a little neighborhood close to it, they protested and because of the burial ground, and the city denied the rezoning request on their behalf. Later, the neighbors put a marker in memory of those who died and were buried from smallpox in that place, but nobody seems to know if they're still there. There's some shallow, unmarked graves on the hillside near Chilhowie Park. The property is deserted, it's overgrown with brush and vines. In 2001, we know Jack wrote a column, he and another doctor went up there and found the dents where the graves were. None of them are marked, but they were still there in 2001. I don't know if they still are. Maybe this winter when the brush dies back, I live close by. I'm gonna sneak up there and see if I can find this place. But I want to look at the marker. I want to make sure that the marker is still there, because this is the only place that's left of these poor people that came there and died, and they never came home and were buried in the dark of night. So I just think if there's any place that has a right to be haunted, that hill has a place. I'm going to go up there. Okay, so smallpox was declared eradicated in the last part of the 20th century, and with the invention of antibiotics, penicillin in particular, there was a new understanding of germ transmission. Cholera became less common too, even in places less urban than Knoxville. But in 1918, Knoxville would again become a ghost town because a new virus came across the Atlantic, leaving a trail of death, the Spanish flu. Now, the name isn't really accurate because the origin of the influenza virus that caused it remains a mystery to this day. They are still doing research on this, by the way. I read some of it. Europe was at war during this time, and most of the countries had very strict controls on the press. They would not allow them to print anything that would look like a weakness to the enemy. But Spain was not under those restrictions. So their newspapers were full of headlines about this terrible new disease, and even the King of Spain caught it. So everybody assumed that Spain was where it came from, and it was called the Spanish flu for that reason. In reality, soldiers all over Europe were just falling like flies to this especially virulent form of influenza, and American soldiers brought it back to this country before anybody realized how dangerous it was. This was our first encounter with H1N1, and it attacked differently from previous strains. Most virus-borne illnesses started out like the common cold, accompanied by headache and maybe some pain in the joints. Then the patients developed fever, hallucinations. They bled from the nose, stomach, intestines, even their ears. They coughed up blood as their skin turned blue and then black. People who survived could develop a lingering hacking cough, which could turn into a deadly pneumonia. Autopsies revealed people died with fluid-filled lungs. Bloody fluid, by the way. Another difference was the people who got sick. Most influenza preys on the very young, toddlers and infants, or the old, or people already weakened by other illnesses. But in 1918, it struck people who were sort of in the prime of life, people who were young and healthy. It was rapidly fatal in people from age 20 to 40. And the reason is better understood now, but still hard to explain. Now, I'm going to try to explain this. We have an infectious disease expert over here, so she's going to explain what you didn't understand afterwards. Just ask her. When the virus is detected by a person's immune system, large numbers of white blood cells were activated and would release enzymes called cytokines to summon other immune cells to combat the infection. This would produce more cytokines, and in a very healthy person, the response to the inflammation would get out of control. It would produce what they call a cytokine storm, and that would cause loss of appetite, vomiting, diarrhea, rashes, rapid breathing, and rapid heart rate. The blood pressure would dive, the patient would go into seizures, delirium, hallucinations, and tremors. This overreaction of the immune response in conjunction with the viral infection was what was so rapidly fatal. The soldiers returning home from the battlefield brought the virus back to America, and it spread to the civilian population before anyone realized what was going on. Before it was over, the 1918 pandemic, we're a pandemic now, bigger than an epidemic, it would claim 50 million lives around the world, including 675,000 in the US, and it would reduce the life expectancy in this country by 12 years. In Knoxville, as elsewhere, doctors were slow to recognize the problem. Soldiers arrived at the Knoxville train station on their way to training camps at Chilhowie Park. This was early October 2nd and 3rd. The training exercises were also held on the campus of the University of Tennessee. When the soldiers began to show symptoms, the local doctors thought at first it was grippe, an old-fashioned word for respiratory infections or colds. Then the soldiers developed symptoms associated with the dreaded Spanish flu. Still, the doctors and health professionals thought they could isolate the disease by quarantining the doctors at the camp, right? Just keep them separate from the civilians, except they got here on the train, remember? And some of them had taken the time to take a trolley ride into town, visit businesses and restaurants, maybe friends who lived in the area. During their breaks in training, they socialized, and the civilian population had already been exposed. Cases began to appear in Knoxville hospitals. The Secretary of Knoxville's Board of Health, Dr. W.R. Cochran, wasn't overly concerned. He told local reporters the illness was under control, and he didn't expect many people to get sick if due precautions were taken. He advised people to stay out of crowds and stay in well-ventilated spaces, be outdoors as much as possible. But more cases poured into local hospitals, and soon they were overwhelmed. By October 9th, 197 soldiers and 604 civilians were sick. 3 people had died. Doctors and nurses fell ill to the virus, and Knoxville General Hospital was out of beds. The 40-bed Riverside Hospital and the Blacks-only hospital at Knoxville College were also deluged with cases of flu. The inadequacy of the response by local health care is what helped spur the construction of Fort Sanders Hospital in the 1920s. But that's still in the future. On October 9th, the Board of Health ordered a closure of schools, churches, theaters, and pool rooms. Civic events were canceled unless they had something to do with the war effort, like a Liberty Bond. That Liberty Bond event that was allowed to go on probably caused several more of the cases because there were lots of young people in that crowd. UT and Knoxville Business College canceled their classes. The East Tennessee Fair went for 3 days and ended. Once again, pestilence had turned Knoxville into a ghost town, and as workers fell ill, factories and coal mines could not fill their shifts. I have a couple of Tennessee Telephone and Telegraph were having trouble because they didn't have enough switchboard operators for phone calls to be made. So the jail was hit very hard because the officers were sick. They didn't have enough people to be on guard, and the prisoners were sick too. So it was a particularly difficult 4 weeks in our history. Red Cross workers wearing gauze masks over their faces would greet the recruits coming into the station and make them go straight to the camp. And they set up quarantine clinics near the camps to treat the afflicted soldiers, but with sickness among the doctors and nurses, they might not be relieved for days. On October 17th, they issued an urgent appeal for volunteers to volunteer for nursing duties. The papers had reported more deaths by October 12th, but the totals aren't exact because cases outside the city limits often went unreported. Whole families would go down with the flu, and in some places, neighbors came in to act as temporary nurses until one of the family members recovered enough to take care of the others. I read an interview with a survivor from a small farm outside of Knoxville, and she remembered her entire family being ill, and she, at 10 years old, struggling to drag herself to the kitchen to fix breakfast for the rest of her family. They were all too sick, and her legs and arms, she said, felt like they had been broken. They were hurting so much. Another survivor said that she had a nosebleed that lasted for days until she was so weak she couldn't even get out of bed. On October 14th, Knoxville pharmacies had exhausted their supplies of medicine, and they had to telegram other pharmacies all over the country trying to get more supplies. Policemen were ordered to arrest people for spitting on the street. I think they should still do that. They also broke up groups of more than 2. So we would have definitely been illegal back then. They delivered fierce lectures to anybody that they saw coughing or sneezing without covering their mouth. The papers were full of advice on how to avoid germs, of course. So they said things like frequent hand washing, wearing clean clothing, staying warm while you're out of doors. And the city reeked of Vicks Vapor Rub, which had been advertised heavily as a problem, helping the flu symptoms. Now, Dr. E.L. Bishop of the State Board of Health condemned promiscuous and non-essential kissing. He said it could truly be the kiss of death. Now, streetcars were normally not very popular in the fall months because they weren't heated, but during the flu month, they became much more popular because they had open windows, so they were well ventilated, and everybody would get on a streetcar rather than get in a closed bus. The streetcar attendants washed them down with disinfectant every night. The public library did stay open because people were encouraged to stay home and they would need something to read, right? But they took out all the chairs and the benches, so you couldn't sit down in the library. You had to get your books and leave. No congregating here, folks. No lingering around. So Knoxville would be closed down for 4 weeks, and it finally began to reopen schools and businesses on November 4th and 5th. And by then, there were 213 deaths reported in the city, with 75 more in Knox County, and over 7,000 cases of flu reported. In those days, remember, Knox County didn't even have an official health department, so we don't know how many cases went unrecognized in those days. Now, H1N1 is still around, and research goes on trying to figure out how it works and how to protect the public against it. New viruses mutate, and new vaccines have to be developed every year to fight them. We have not had a worldwide pandemic like the 1918 flu in this century, but epidemics still make the news. We're all of us familiar with HIV, with Ebola, with Zika virus. You know, information travels much faster now. So we hope, we're definitely more watchful, and we hope we're more prepared. But every fall, Knoxville braces itself for another flu season. And every year, those same warnings still go out. Wash your hands. Cover your mouth and nose. Stay out of crowds. Any of you had your flu shot yet? Watch that promiscuous kissing. All right, that's all I have, but I'll have lots of notes here, so if anybody has questions, I'm happy to answer questions, and we can kind of hang out and make this informal. I'm not going to make you raise your hand or anything like that, but if you have a question, I'll be glad to try to answer it if anybody does. So, yes.
I was reading about some of the historic epidemics and pandemics, and I guess that there's some speculation that, there was this belief in early Christianity that cleaning oneself with water was excessive. Did you come across anything?
Oh yeah, they had some of them had sort of prejudices against taking baths. And another interesting thing that you brought up religion, and I meant to mention this earlier, for almost every epidemic, the governor or the mayor would proclaim a day of fasting and prayer. And so when Governor Bill Lee did that, I was like, oh God, is there an epidemic and I just haven't heard about this? I mean, I was deep in this research. Every single epidemic, there was at least one day of fasting and prayer. So when I heard that on the radio, I'm like, gave me a heart attack. But yeah, their religious beliefs had a lot to do with their hygiene, and some religions required hand washing, like the Jewish religion did, and ritual hand washing, ritual baths before you go into worship. But early Christians here in this country, no, bathing was considered excessive, I don't know, might lead to dancing, who knows?
You mentioned the whole family's wiped out and the town becoming a ghost town essentially. So were there people that came in afterwards that took advantage of the unfortunate people, that they've left their properties here, their houses? They could just come in and move in. And
Yeah, well, part of it though was a lot of this property was on that cheap land down by where the water is. So, but I did notice that there were businesses that came and acquired that property after part of the poor neighborhood would be torn down and a business built there, and that is very true that people came back. Not all the people who left came back, even if they had just fled and had survived. So I'm sure some of that did go on more than I noticed. I did see some record of businesses taking over what had been private property before. So rezoning.
That's what I was thinking, how it would have changed the,
I'm sure it did probably change the configuration of the town. Anybody else?
Sorry, did you come across anything like in the earlier epidemics about obviously the doctors had the beliefs in poor tumors and whatnot. Were there any more local healers who used herbs or other types of treatments, or was it just like the doctors well-known people?
Well, there were lots of amateur doctors in those days. I was a dental professional in my early life, so we learned then that barbers did dentistry back in those days and surgery, yes. So I'm sure there were some of those amateur doctors, and this was, remember, this was Appalachia, so there wasn't a lot of health professionals available. So out in the country areas, there were more of the herbalist type healers who might have learned these things from their Cherokee ancestors. I know that one of my grandmothers was considered to be a nurse or a doctor woman. That's what the Cherokee called her. And so there's a sort of a granny medicine kind of thing here in the Appalachians, and that's more the herbalist type of herbs and things like that. Not terribly effective against influenza, but at least, if you keep them on fluids, that's got to help somehow. So.
Well, not to mention that they were probably more in the outlying areas where they're getting more fruits and vegetables so they're healthy.
Yeah, if the further you were away from other people, really the better off you were, because you didn't have that contamination. It was the concentration of people in the urban areas with all that waste that they didn't know that they should treat and keep away from their water supply. I mean, they discovered the cause of cholera in England. We were just talking about this beforehand when Dr. John Stone. There was a pump, and all these families were getting water from this same pump, and they were all getting sick. Well, a lady had washed the diapers of her sick infant in that water from that pump and contaminated it. And he figured out that all these families that were getting sick were getting water from that same pump, so he took the handle off the pump, and the cases stopped, no more cases. And there's clues like that. I mean, I'm reading Dr. Bailey's report, and you could see he's almost there. He's almost figured this out. He just didn't read enough. I mean, if he had read Dr. Stone's, Dr. Stone tried to tell people what was going on, but back in those days, microbes were not considered to be, most people didn't even believe in them. They didn't have enough education to realize that they existed. And those who did know that they exist really weren't sure, like I said, their life cycles and their behaviors and the path of infection, that just wasn't very well understood, even by people who were well educated in those days. So there were probably people out in the country who survived and didn't even have any of these illnesses because their privy was down on low ground and it didn't run into their creek that they got their water from and that sort of thing. So,
well, you mentioned the smallpox. I read where Jenner had found out that the milkmaids didn't get smallpox because they'd already had cowpox.
Yeah, and he was the one who figured out that there was an antibody of some sort. He didn't call it that. And he spent his life trying to get people to believe that that really was true. I mean, he did all kinds of research, and he was just a country doctor. But he just noticed this because he was in a district that had cows in it, that the dairy maids never got smallpox. So he started doing research and figured out what was going on. But as I said, nobody would believe him because nobody really understood microbes back then.
So Laura, can we conclude that science is good?
I always think that seeking after knowledge is to be recommended. So yes, we should always try to understand as much as we can. That's why I love doing research, because I always learn something fascinating and new. And I did when I did research for this talk, yes.
Yeah, Pest House over off Prosser, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it owned by the city still? Or
I don't know who owns that property, but I would expect the city probably still owns it. I know that somebody back in when I saw those newspaper stories, Bert Vincent mentioned it in his column too, because he was trying to find exactly where it was. And he put a call out in his column saying, this lady's trying to stop this guy from rezoning this and moving this cemetery. And apparently somebody knew and contacted the lady, and they were able to get the location of it. If I go look for it, I may have to take Jack with me because he's been there. He's kind of tried to tell me, but it's hard to imagine, even though I live close by. I think the city probably still owns it. It's just nothing's been done to it. And in my mind, when you have a place like that, you really should keep it at least mowed and cleaned up twice a year, clean the underbrush back, and just let people be able to get to the memorial marker at least and see what it was. It is part of our history. So I would like something to be done. And like I said, we don't even know if they're still buried there. They could have been exhumed, but no way to tell. There's nobody's got any records of what happened to them after that. So.
Brown Skin River. Any other questions?
All right, stay away from the scarificator, guys.